Hi, this is Dylan Hantula, and today I'm going to be presenting a paper called Acoustic Fingerprinting Revisited Generates Stable Device ID Stealthily with Inaudible Sound. This paper was created by a group of people in the Department of Information Engineering at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Throughout the presentation, I use different images from the paper. So rather than cite them throughout, I will just cite it here. Smartphones play a significant role in our day-to-day lives. Many people in modern day have a smartphone. In fact, sales increased by 40% year over year. For many people, a smartphone can be their main form of computing. So that means that they might not even own a different device, like a traditional desktop computer or a laptop. And the reason that it's such a main form of computing for many is that it integrates with a lot of different parts of life. So, for example, people are able to do their banking, people are able to talk to friends, people are able to surf the web and look up information, all of the things that they would normally do on a regular computer. So these are all applications that people use daily and are obviously an important part of their day-to-day lives. Now, it's great that smartphones have played such an important role in our lives and have been able to help people as much as they have. But unfortunately, there are some downsides to smartphones. Um, First and foremost, they're a common target for attackers. And there's many reasons for that. One of which is that they often contain more personal data than traditional PCs. So, like we said before, people are doing mobile banking. That's obviously has sensitive information tied to it. People have their entire contacts lists. Smartphones do location tracking. People have personal pictures, conversations through text messages and phone calls and other means like that. All of these things are very personal data and sensitive information that could be harmful if it fell into the wrong hands of an attacker. So, smartphones inherently put users at risk of compromising their personal data more so than traditional PCs. They're also more easily stolen than a traditional computer because one, they're smaller, so you can put it in a pocket and walk away with it or something like that. But two, more importantly, they're taken almost everywhere. So people are hardly without their phones if they have a phone nowadays. Unlike a personal computer or a laptop, people are taking their phones way more places than they're taking their regular computers, which puts them at risk for being stolen. So one thing about smartphones is that it's often difficult to track or identify the users of smartphones. There's different ways that people try to do this. For example, cookies, which are used in a browser, but they can often be cleared by the user at any time. You can also try to use a MAC address to uniquely identify the device, but they can often be spoofed and aren't as reliable. A lot of mobile devices will come with a unique identifier burned into the hardware, which sounds like a perfect solution, except for Apple discontinued access to its unique device identifier. So that means that applications running in iOS can no longer access that unique hardware identifier. Similarly, Android has the IMEI, which uniquely identifies each device. That requires a special permission, and that permission could be revoked by Google at any time, just like Apple did. People have also tried to use Bluetooth modules, but they have short range and the connection can be very unreliable. On top of that, people are starting to actively avoid being tracked or identified in any way. Privacy has become at the forefront of people's minds when they're in their online habits or just computing habits in general, which obviously makes it more difficult to identify a smartphone or a smartphone user uniquely. While it seems like you wouldn't have any real reason to do that unless it was a malicious reason, there are still legitimate use cases for identifying users and phones, and we'll talk about that later. So a new solution that's been brought up in light of the former solutions like cookies and so forth not working has been acoustic fingerprinting, and that's really what this paper has been all about. So this paper suggests using a hardware-based identification of a smartphone by leveraging the frequency response in the speaker. So the way that this works is nearly all smartphones come with built-in speakers. The speakers are used to play music, have calls on speakerphone, and things like that. But the thing is that no two speakers produce an identical wave of sound. So smartphones typically use low-cost speakers, which makes the variability even more. So, for example, two speakers producing the same or playing the same piece of sound won't have exactly the same sound waves. And so basically we're going to be using that to uniquely identify the phone. Older approaches have attempted this, but they used a piece of music. So obviously that's not ideal because the piece of music can be heard by humans, which is disruptive, susceptible to background noise interference, considering it's in the same range that we hear everything. And so that was not the best solution. But this solution, however, it suggests using a audio frequency that's higher than 14 kilohertz, which means that most, if not all, humans won't be able to hear it. So you can see in this graph where the check mark is, it's in the threshold of audibility, which means that it can still be picked up by like a microphone or something like that in general, but it's still outside of the realm that normal humans can hear, which makes it a much better solution. So basically this can be going on as people are going about their day-to-day lives, and they would have no idea because they can't hear it, which is obviously more ideal because you don't want your phone playing a noise that you can hear whenever. So like we were saying, the benefits of using a higher frequency are that it's difficult for humans to hear sounds in that range, but there's also less competing noise in the higher frequency ranges. So there's a lot more noise in the range that humans can hear. So that makes this solution even more so better because one, humans can't hear it, and there's also less competing noise in order to mess up the ability to pick up the sounds. And then on top of that, speakers actually perform more diversely at higher frequency ranges. So the newer speakers are optimized for the frequency ranges that are within what humans can hear for obvious reasons. Because why would you optimize something for a range that humans can't hear if it's mostly meant to be for humans to hear the sound coming from it? So that provides more consistent, unique device ID generation with lower false positives and lower false negative rates, because as we said before, the speakers need to be variable in order to produce a unique ID. This particular study in this paper is outputting a stable combination of 70 different frequencies. So that allows us for noises not on those frequencies to be filtered out. The three goals achieved with this approach that the writers of the paper made very clear were robustness, uniqueness, and stealthiness. So first, robustness. You want to be able to generate consistent fingerprints for the same device at different times under different scenarios. So basically, if you were to generate a fingerprint or an ID, we're using those two words interchangeably essentially, at one time, and then go to generate it again at a different time and they were different, obviously that wouldn't work. That's like having somebody change their name or changing an ID number for something. It doesn't have any referential integrity. And then uniqueness is obviously no two devices should share the same ID. That would lead to problems for obvious reasons. You mistake one device for another, and that wouldn't work. And then stealthiness. You want it to be unnoticeable by device owners, otherwise nobody would buy into this solution. If it was, like we said before, a piece of music or something like that that was disruptive, nobody would want to use this. So the way that the ID is created is actually pretty simple. From a high level, the audio is played, and again, the audio is outside of the range that humans can hear. The phone listens to the audio with the microphone that's built into the phone. The phone pre-processes the audio so that it's in a format that can be understood by the server. The pre-processed audio is then sent to the server, and then the server returns the unique ID formed from that audio. Now, obviously, the caveat to this is that this solution does require access to the internet in order for the audio to be sent to the server. So that is one thing to think about. There are bandwidth costs associated with this. The study that was done, that's described in the paper, follows a simple procedure. First, the scientists would emit an audio clip and have the phone's microphone listen to it or ingest it. They would pre-process that clip and send it to the server. They would receive the ID back. They would check that the ID is unique across all trials from all phones. And then they would go ahead and repeat this process and check that the ID returned is the same every time for the same phone and speakers. Now, they ran this study, or many different trials of this study, across many different sets of hardware, and we'll look into that in just a few slides. So the study setup, each round of experiments was conducted on a single Samsung Galaxy S3. And the way they were able to do this is that they got a bunch of Samsung Galaxy S3s, and they modified them such that the speaker could be swapped in and out very easily. They basically made the speaker pluggable rather than fully built in the way that the phone comes. That way, they're able to hold the phone itself constant while changing out the speakers and making sure that it would produce a different ID. That's because it actually made the study much more restrained in such a way that it's easier to distinguish phones of different models and from different manufacturers. So if they were emitting sounds from an iPhone and then using that to generate an ID, and then they would emit a sound from like a Samsung Galaxy or a different phone and then use that to create an ID, it'd be easier to distinguish those apart. And the theory is that the IDs would be more likely to be unique, which is the goal. So in order to make it more restrained, to ensure that this will work regardless of what phone hardware is being used, they use the same phone hardware. They just swap the speaker out from other phones of the same model. The tests were conducted in offices, streets, metro stations, places that people would encounter in their day-to-day life to maintain the realistic environment. They wanted to see how it would work with normal background noise that anyone would experience, to see if this is actually a feasible solution that would work in the real world rather than something that might just work in a lab setting. Overall, 50 different speakers were tested, each with 60 sets of response features. So that means 3,000 total vectors were collected and tested to ensure that this was the study, or the results of the study rather, were sound. So this is a picture of some of the hardware used. You can see there's a bunch of different Samsung Galaxy S3s, and you can see they have wires coming out of them. And that's the modified speakers that we were talking about. So the speakers are actually the same. It's just the phone was modified in such a way that the speaker can be plugged and unplugged from the phone very easily, which means that the speakers can be swapped. So that means you can use one phone and swap the speaker out if you just unplug it from a different phone and then plug it into that phone. And the plug is the black connector that you see on the right-hand side picture with the single phone. So the results of the study proved that the unique device IDs can be created using this method. Surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, it yielded no false positives nor false negatives. So a false positive would be if one phone, say phone A, was falsely recognized as phone B. So that's kind of obviously an issue, because then it's not an identifier anymore. And then a false negative would be if there's no matches found for an ID produced by a phone, despite the phone existing. So if the ID was different each time. So if the phone produced one ID and that was saved in the database as that phone's ID, and then later down the line the phone produced another ID and it didn't match the original ID, obviously that would be a false negative. The study proved that this method of producing unique IDs is long-term stable. So over a long period of time, the ID produced doesn't show any signs of changing when it's generated again. And that's good news because that means that this wouldn't be a feasible solution if the IDs were subject to change and then suddenly they weren't the same IDs any longer. There was some effect of noise interference. Like I said previously, the tests were run in metro stations, office settings, places like that do have background noise. But something to note is that it only has an effect when the noise is in that high frequency range. Now, again, that high frequency range is outside of the range that humans can hear. That doesn't mean that sound doesn't exist there. It just means that humans can't hear that sound. There is less interference there, but according to the study, the metro station did produce noises in that high frequency range that compromised the creation of a new ID using this method. The study looked into the amount of entropy that this procedure would create. So entropy is the measurement of how many devices can be identified using this scheme. Oftentimes people will talk about bits of entropy. So, some randomness produces X number of bits of entropy, and that can determine how many different possible combinations can be used. So, for example, if the amount of entropy only supported 100 unique identifiers, obviously the scheme would only work for 100 devices. In this scenario, this study found 39.6 possible bits of entropy using this method of identification. So that produces a whole lot of possible identifiers, more identifiers than all the mobile phones in the world, which is important because if it didn't, then two phones would have to end up getting the same identifier. If you can imagine, in the example I just brought up before, if there's only 100 different unique identifiers possible and you had 1,000 phones, obviously there would be overlap in the identifiers, and then that wouldn't work because then the identifiers would not be unique. So this was an important part of the study to make sure that this was actually feasible for the amount of mobile phones that exist and will continue to exist moving forward. So there are many different application uses for this type of technology and this method of generating unique identifiers. But one is self-fingerprinting. So self-fingerprinting would be like an application gets the device ID of the device on which it is running. So an example of that would be like the phone plays noise. It has an application listen to the noise and then uses the sound waves to create the unique identifier based on the steps that we described earlier. Now this would be a good substitute for something like the unique identifier that comes on an Apple device that Apple no longer allows applications to access, or the unique identifier that comes on the hardware of an Android device that Google may or may not end up discontinuing moving forward. So this is a good way for a phone to identify itself, and then it can send that ID to other applications or in other communications. And then there's also cross fingerprinting. So this would be like an application gets the device ID of a different device. So instead of the phone playing a noise or emitting a noise and then listening to its own noise, the phone can listen to a noise from a different device and then follow the same steps to get the ID of that device from the sound waves of the noise emitted. This is ends up being pretty impactful in other use cases that we'll see in a little bit. So again, some more use cases would be this could replace traditional cookies as well as the unique hardware identifiers that we talked about before. And another one would be location information broadcast and relays. So imagine this situation. There are many applications, obviously, that require access to a phone's current GPS location, like maps. I know Yelp has a location service where, if you walk near a restaurant, it'll give you a notification for the restaurant specials or things like that. So imagine there are like 10 phones in a conference room. Only one phone would actually need to have its GPS location services turned on. Then phone A can periodically broadcast its ID using the speaker and the method we've been talking about. And then using the cross fingerprinting that we just mentioned, phone B, a second phone, can pick up that ID and then relay it to the server. So that way the server then knows that phone A and phone B are essentially in the same location, or at least they were in the same location at the time the noise was played, and location can't be any farther than the area in which a normal cell phone speaker can play its noise. So obviously they can't be miles away because a cell phone speaker noise can't be heard from miles away. They would have to be close by. So now the server knows phone B's location without ever having to access its GPS data. So that's pretty powerful because, one, you can save on battery by having your GPS turned off, but you can also increase privacy. You don't have to be tracked at all times. You can only send your location when necessary, and even still, you can not allow the server to access your location. You can tell it your location based on this cross fingerprinting use case. Another one would be indoor tracking. So, for example, as a user walks around a grocery store, the phone can periodically play a sound that broadcasts its ID. Now, depending on which microphone in the store picks up that sound and where that microphone is located, the server can then determine the user's path through the store. So, similar to the use case just described previously, obviously the phone can't send its sound very far. This one is a little bit more difficult because grocery stores are smaller places, so depending on the configuration of the microphones and where they're placed, more than one microphone might be able to pick up the same sound. But obviously this is predicated on that not being the case, and only one microphone at a time can pick up the sound. So when a microphone picks up the sound of the phone, it can use the method that we've been describing to get the phone's ID. And then when the next microphone picks up the sound, it can get the phone's ID, and then you would have timestamps of where the phone has been throughout the store. And then another use case is uniquely identifying a compromised or stolen device. So you can imagine a situation in which a thief steals a device and somebody reports it as stolen, and they go to get the device back, and then it becomes an argument of, oh, this isn't actually your device, this is a different device, and maybe they try and mask that somehow. This would be a way of identifying that device consistently every single time, unless the thief changes out the hardware. Now, normally, thieves won't change out the speakers of a phone immediately after stealing it. Perhaps they would if this were to be a mainstream use of identifying devices, but in the near term, this would be one way of uniquely identifying a device, no matter where it is or who has it or what's been done to it or what software changes have happened or anything like that, because it's all dependent on the hardware, dependent on the speakers, to create the identifier. Now, there are some limitations to this method of generating identification. First and foremost, noise interference. Kind of like what was mentioned before with the metro station. While the noise is out of range for humans to hear, that does not mean that there is not other noise there. And in the case of the metro station, there was other noise there. And that was an obstacle to successfully generating the identifier because the noise was distorted or interfered with by the background noise. The study was also not conducted on a wide range of phones and speakers, so there is a possibility the experiments would have turned out differently. In this case, the experiments turned out that this would be potentially a viable way of uniquely identifying phones, at least by the standards of there was no false positives, there was no false negatives, things like that. But perhaps if they use different hardware, that wouldn't be the case. And then an application using this could request microphone access, obviously in order to listen to the sound that's being emitted, and then abuse that access for illegitimate purposes, which obviously presents a security and a privacy risk if you have something listening to you and potentially doing something untoward with the sounds that it's picking up.